The decision didn't look like much when he made it. No paperwork, no handshake, no money exchanged. In fact, there was no money at all. 0 in his bank account, 0 in his wallet, 0 people who believed it would matter. If anyone had been watching him that night, they would have missed it completely. It happened quietly, in a room lit by a single flickering bulb, with the sound of traffic leaking in through a cracked window and the weight of failure pressing down on a man who had run out of excuses. He was 29 years old and already exhausted in a way that felt permanent. Not the tiredness that sleep fixes, but the kind that settles into your bones when life keeps proving you wrong. The mattress on the floor was thin. The air smelled like dust and old takeaway containers. On the table sat an unopened envelope marked "Final Notice." He didn't need to read it. He already knew what it said. $0 changes how the world looks. Food becomes math. Time becomes an enemy. Pride becomes a luxury you can't afford. He had crossed that line weeks ago, when the last freelance payment fell through and the landlord stopped answering texts. Since then, every morning had begun with the same question: what can I delay today without everything collapsing? That night, the question was different. What do I stop doing forever? He sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at his phone, thumb hovering over social media apps he opened out of habit more than desire. Every scroll felt like salt in an open wound. People announcing promotions, launches, weddings, wins, the highlight reel of a world that had moved on without him. He locked the screen and tossed the phone aside like it had insulted him. He had followed the rules, at least the ones he was told mattered. Get educated, work hard, be patient, say yes when opportunity knocks. But opportunity, he had learned, knocked very selectively, and patience, when paired with the wrong direction, was just slow failure. He thought about all the advice he'd absorbed over the years. Work harder, network more, be positive, grind, hustle. None of it had saved him from zero. None of it explained why people less capable than him seemed to glide upward while he sank. The anger rose, sharp and hot, then faded into something colder: clarity. The problem wasn't effort, it wasn't intelligence, it wasn't even bad luck, not entirely. The problem was that he had been renting his future from systems that didn't care whether he ever owned it. That thought sat with him, heavy but undeniable. Every job he'd had, every deal he'd chased, every opportunity he'd begged for approval from someone else. He had been waiting to be chosen, and $0 had finally stripped that illusion away. He stood up and walked to the small mirror near the door. The man looking back wasn't broken. He looked stripped down, like everything unnecessary had been burned away. No backup plan, no safety net, no image to protect, just truth. If nothing changes, this is it, he thought, and if that's true, then I'm free to change everything. The decision formed slowly, then all at once. He would stop trading time for permission, stop chasing roles designed to keep him replaceable, stop optimizing for approval. It cost no money to decide this, just pride, just fear, just the last remaining comfort of pretending someone else held the keys. That was the $0 decision. He wouldn't ask how to get hired anymore. He would ask how value moved. He wouldn't ask what people were willing to pay him. He would ask what they were already paying for and why. He wouldn't compete where margins were thin and egos were loud. He would position himself where problems were boring, ignored, and expensive to misunderstand. He didn't announce this to anyone. There was no one to announce it to. The world didn't change when he made the decision. The room didn't get brighter. His phone didn't ring. His bank balance stayed at 0.
But something fundamental shifted. For the first time in years, his future felt unwritten instead of delayed. He grabbed a notebook from a drawer, pages yellowed and half-used, and began writing questions instead of goals. Who controls access? Where does money get stuck? What breaks when pressure hits? The questions felt dangerous, like they weren't meant for someone in his position. That made them interesting. He read obsessively, not motivational quotes, not success porn. He studied industries people call dull, supply chains, compliance, middlemen, bottlenecks. He noticed something strange the more he learned. The richest people were rarely at the front of the story. They were behind it, invisible, positioned where decisions passed through them whether others liked it or not. Days blurred into nights. He walked instead of taking buses. He listened more than he spoke. He asked naive questions that disarmed people. With nothing to sell and nothing to lose, he became dangerous in a quiet way. People explained things to him because he wasn't trying to impress them. The zero didn't disappear overnight. Hunger didn't either, but desperation began turning into discipline. He stopped thinking in weeks and started thinking in systems. He stopped reacting and started observing. The world, once overwhelming, began to reveal patterns. By the time he turned 30, he still had no money, no title, no visible progress, but the zero decision had already begun compounding. While others chased paychecks, he was mapping leverage. While others complained about the system, he was learning where it bent. No one noticed, and that was the point. Because the decisions that change everything rarely look like anything at all when they're made. And this was only the beginning.
The strange thing about deciding to step outside the system is that the system doesn't immediately fight back. It ignores you. And for a while, that silence feels like proof that you made a mistake. Weeks passed after the $0 decision, and nothing dramatic happened. No sudden breakthrough, no lucky phone call, no mentor appearing out of thin air. The city kept moving at the same speed, indifferent to his internal revolution. People hurried to offices, complained about bosses, waited for weekends. From the outside, he looked like just another man falling behind. But inside, something had changed permanently. He no longer woke up asking who might hire him. He woke up asking what invisible problems people tolerated because fixing them felt inconvenient. He noticed inefficiencies everywhere once he trained himself to look for them. Not the flashy problems everyone talked about, but the quiet ones that drained time, money, and energy without anyone realizing how much. He spent mornings in public libraries because they were warm and free. Afternoons walking industrial areas where businesses hid behind boring signage. Evenings listening, really listening to how people complained. Complaints, he learned, were unpaid market research. One afternoon, sitting near a loading dock outside a mid-sized distribution warehouse, he overheard a conversation that would have meant nothing to his old self. Two managers arguing about delays. Not dramatic delays, small ones. Paperwork issues, verification steps, a process that existed only because that's how it's always been done. The numbers they mentioned were casual, tens of thousands here, hundreds of thousands there, losses absorbed as cost of doing business. He didn't interrupt, he didn't pitch, he didn't pretend to have answers. He went home and wrote the problem down. That night he couldn't sleep, not from anxiety, but from focus. He replayed the conversation, mapping it against everything he'd been learning. The problem wasn't unique. It existed in different forms across dozens of industries, a bottleneck created by outdated coordination. Everyone accepted it because solving it would require someone to take responsibility without authority. Responsibility without authority. That phrase stuck with him. Most people waited for permission to fix things. The wealthiest people quietly fixed things and then charged for access to the fix. He didn't have the solution yet, but for the first time, he had a target.
The next weeks were awkward. He showed up places he didn't belong, asked questions that made people pause. Not threatening questions, curious ones. How long does this take? What happens if it fails? Who signs off on this? Who eats the cost? Sometimes people brushed him off. Sometimes they talked too much. Either way, he learned. He noticed a pattern. The people closest to the problem had the least power to change it. The people with power were far from the pain. That gap, that distance, was where leverage lived. Still, leverage without resources was just theory, and theory didn't pay rent. The pressure crept back in slowly. Hunger sharpened his thoughts, but also his fear. There were days he questioned whether clarity alone could keep the lights on. Friends stopped calling. Pride kept him from explaining. He told himself this was the price of opting out early. Then came the moment that nearly broke the decision. A former colleague reached out with an offer. Not glamorous, a contract role, decent pay, familiar work, familiar ceiling. It was everything he used to want, arriving just when things were hardest. He stared at the email longer than he wanted to admit. The money would solve immediate problems. The relief would be instant. The future cost invisible. He imagined himself 6 months later, busy again, tired again, telling himself he'd get back to the bigger plan soon. He had lived that loop before. It always ended the same way. The $0 decision was tested that night. Turning down paid work when you have no money feels irrational, almost irresponsible, but he understood something now that he hadn't before. Short-term relief was the most expensive currency of all. He declined politely, closed the laptop, sat in silence while fear screamed at him for hours. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Because he was no longer available, he became useful in a different way. A contact he'd been casually talking to, someone mid-level, overlooked, frustrated, asked him a question. Not for advice, for help thinking. No payment offered, just curiosity. He listened, asked questions, drew connections, suggested a workaround. Nothing revolutionary, just clarity applied without ego. A week later, that contact called again, this time with urgency. The workaround had worked. It had saved time, reduced friction. Someone higher up had noticed. Still no money, but attention. Attention, he realized, was upstream from opportunity. He didn't rush it. He didn't try to monetize immediately. He focused on being the person who could see around corners, the one who explained complexity without making others feel stupid, the one who solved problems quietly. Word spread slowly, sideways, not up, not down, sideways through people who did the real work. Months passed. His life was still fragile, but his position was changing. He was no longer invisible. He was undefined, and undefined scared people just enough to take him seriously. Then came the real offer. Not a job, not a salary, a question wrapped in hesitation. What would it cost, someone asked, for you to handle this permanently? He asked what this meant. They explained, a recurring problem, a known leak. No one wanted to own it. He didn't answer right away. He went home and did the math. Not just financial math, power math. If he said yes, he would be responsible without authority again, unless he structured it differently. His old him would have named a number and hoped for approval. The new him asked for control. Not ownership, not equity, control over the process. The silence on the other end of the line was long, heavy. Finally, they agreed. The first money he made after the $0 decision wasn't impressive by outsider standards. It wouldn't make headlines, but it was clean, recurring, tied to leverage instead of hours. More importantly, it changed how others saw him. He wasn't broke anymore. He was positioned. And once positioning clicks, scale stops being a mystery. He didn't celebrate. He didn't post about it. He didn't tell anyone. He just adjusted his questions, because now he wasn't asking how to survive. He was asking how to multiply. And that question, once asked seriously, never stops echoing.
Once people began to depend on you without fully understanding why, a quiet shift takes place. You stop being optional, not because you demand importance, but because removing you would create friction no one wants to deal with. That was the phase he entered next. The work multiplied without announcing itself. One problem solved cleanly led to another problem being quietly handed over. Not through contracts at first, but through trust. Someone would say, "Can you look at this?" And then, since you're already involved, maybe you can handle that too. Responsibility accumulated like sediment, layer by layer, until he was embedded deep inside processes no one else fully saw anymore. He learned something crucial during this time. Visibility is overrated. Control often lives where attention does not. Executives talked strategy, managers talked targets. He talked flow. What moved, what stalled, what waited for approval for no reason other than habit. He didn't challenge authority directly. He rerouted it. Decisions began to pass through him simply because it was easier that way. Money followed, but unevenly at first. Some months were strong, others reminded him how fragile everything still was. He resisted the urge to inflate his lifestyle. No expensive signals, no public upgrades. He knew better now. Comfort dulled instincts. Instead, he reinvested quietly, not just cash, but presence. He spent time where outcomes were shaped before they became visible. Late-night calls, early morning site visits, conversations that never made it into meeting notes. The more he listened, the more he saw a truth that separated operators from owners. Most businesses didn't fail because of bad ideas. They failed because of friction. Too many hands touching the same decision, too many incentives misaligned, too many people rewarded for activity instead of outcomes. He positioned himself as the remover of friction, not officially, functionally. That distinction mattered. The first time someone offered him equity, he almost refused, not because he didn't want it, but because he understood its weight. Equity wasn't just upside, it was exposure, responsibility, visibility, scrutiny. He negotiated differently than expected. Smaller percentage, more control over execution, less talk, more leverage. They agreed because they thought they were protecting themselves. They didn't realize they were giving him something far more valuable than ownership, dependency. Once systems were redesigned around his way of thinking, replacing him would require dismantling the entire structure. No board wanted that. No partner wanted that. Stability became tied to his continued presence. That's when his calendar filled up without him asking. People began asking his opinion before making decisions, not because he demanded authority, but because decisions made without him seemed to cost more. Time, money, reputation. He noticed another shift, too. The way people spoke around him changed. Conversations slowed. Words became careful, not fearful, calculating. They were measuring themselves against him, trying to understand how much he knew. He never revealed everything. That was intentional. Power didn't come from having information. It came from controlling when information moved. By his late 30s, he no longer chased opportunities. They circled him, quietly, cautiously, each one a test, each one revealing who understood leverage and who merely wanted access. He said no more than he said yes. Each no increased the value of the next yes. But success, even quiet success, creates distortion. People projected narratives onto him. Some saw brilliance, others saw threat, a few saw a shortcut. He watched all of it without reacting. Reaction was expensive. Then came the deal that forced a choice.
A fast expansion, big capital, rapid scale. The kind of offer that could compress 10 years into 2. The kind of deal people ruin themselves chasing. He saw the cracks immediately. Incentives misaligned, timelines unrealistic, control fragmented. But the numbers were seductive, even to him. For nights he argued with himself. This could change everything or end everything. He remembered the collapse years earlier, the lesson carved into him by loss. Speed without control was just acceleration toward failure. He declined, not publicly, not dramatically, just quietly stepped away. The response was immediate: confusion, pressure, then something else, respect. Not admiration, respect born from restraint. People began to understand something about him then. He wasn't hungry in the way they expected. He wasn't chasing validation. He wasn't desperate to be seen as big. He was building something that didn't need noise to grow. From that point on, his strategy narrowed. Fewer deals, deeper integration. He acquired weaknesses instead of competing with strengths, bought problems cheaply, fixed them systematically, and folded them into something stronger. His businesses didn't expand outward, they folded inward, becoming denser, harder to penetrate. Competitors misread him. They thought he was slow, conservative, risk-averse. They didn't see the lattice forming beneath the surface. Each company fed another. Each dependency reinforced the whole. Cash flow stabilized, predictability increased, risk decreased not through caution, but through design. At 42, he experienced something new: silence. Not the anxious silence of uncertainty, the calm silence of inevitability. Deals closed without urgency. Decisions landed without resistance. Problems surfaced early because people trusted him enough to expose them. He no longer needed to convince. He needed to choose. That was when he understood the final transformation had occurred. He wasn't playing the game anymore. He was shaping the board. And the board, once shaped, favors its architect.
Power announces itself in strange ways, not with applause or headlines, but with pauses. Conversations that slow when you enter a room, emails that wait for your reply before moving forward, decisions that stall until you say nothing or something. He noticed it gradually. People began framing problems differently around him, not asking what he thought should be done, but how he would see it. The subtle shift from consultation to calibration. They weren't seeking advice anymore. They were aligning themselves with an outcome they assumed he already understood. That assumption was dangerous, because the moment people believe you see everything, they stop telling you everything. He learned that lesson the hard way. The first real crack appeared where he least expected it, not in finance, not in operations, but in loyalty. A senior operator, someone he had elevated and trusted, began making minor adjustments without looping him in. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just small decisions justified as efficiency. On paper, they made sense. In isolation, they were harmless. But systems don't break in isolation, they break through accumulation. He sensed it before he could prove it. Metrics felt off. Reports arrived too clean, too polished. Reality, he knew, was never that smooth. He started asking questions again, the old questions, the uncomfortable ones. Resistance surfaced. Subtle at first, delayed responses, defensive explanations, a tone shift. The man had tasted authority and mistaken it for ownership. When confronted, the operator didn't deny it. He rationalized it, spoke about trust, about growth, about how things needed to move faster now. He implied, carefully, that maybe the system had outgrown one person's oversight. That was the moment. Not of anger, of clarity. Empires don't collapse from rebellion, they collapse from permission given too loosely. He removed the man within 48 hours. No public scene, no smear, just a quiet separation that sent a message through every layer of the organization. Authority flowed one way, always had, always would. The fallout was immediate: shock, fear, recalibration. But something else happened too. Respect returned. He didn't enjoy that part, the necessity of fear, but he accepted it. Power without consequence invites erosion. He would not repeat the mistake of assuming gratitude was a safeguard. From then on, he restructured leadership entirely. Redundancy everywhere, no single point of failure, no irreplaceable people, including himself. Systems documented, decision trees clarified, incentives realigned. He wasn't hardening out of paranoia, he was hardening out of maturity. The higher he climbed, the more he realized how lonely the top actually was, not emotionally, strategically. There were fewer people he could speak freely with, fewer who understood the full picture, fewer who could challenge him without agenda. So he built a rule for himself: never confuse agreement with alignment. He sought dissent deliberately, paid for it, encouraged it, but always on his terms. Externally, his influence expanded into spaces he once only observed from afar. Regulators returned calls, financial institutions listened differently, politicians recognized his name, not as a donor, but as a stabilizer, someone whose operations employed thousands without noise or scandal. He didn't lobby loudly, he didn't posture, he positioned. When crises hit industries he was embedded in, his organizations absorbed shock instead of amplifying it. While others begged for relief, he provided continuity. Governments noticed that. So did competitors. Some tried to challenge him openly: price wars, talent raids, legal pressure. He responded by doing nothing visible. Instead, he adjusted flow, shifted supply, tightened terms, let others bleed themselves trying to force outcomes he had already neutralized upstream. Months later, rivals collapsed under their own aggression, confused about what had gone wrong. He knew. They had fought where noise lived, not where control resided. By his late 40s, wealth had become abstract. Numbers moved beyond lifestyle impact. He measured success differently now, in resilience, in optionality, in how few emergencies required his direct involvement. That scared him more than poverty ever had. Because ease breeds blindness. So he reintroduced friction into his own life. No assistants filtering everything, no bubble. He visited sites unannounced, took calls personally, stayed close enough to the ground to smell reality before reports sterilized it. That discipline saved him when the next test arrived. A global disruption, supply chains fractured, markets panicked, capital froze, companies with impressive valuations collapsed within quarters. His system bent but did not break. While others scrambled, he acted calmly, acquired distressed assets, absorbed talent released in mass layoffs, consolidated quietly while headlines screamed chaos. People began using a word around him they didn't say to his face: inevitable. At his 50, when analysts finally labeled him a billionaire, he felt nothing. No rush, no victory, just confirmation. The $0 decision had reached its natural conclusion. But he didn't celebrate, because he understood something most never do. The most dangerous moment in any journey is not the fall. It's the moment you believe you've arrived. And he had no intention of arriving anywhere permanent.
By now, the world knew his name, but he moved quietly. Billboards didn't carry it. Interviews were rare.
Media stories touched the surface, numbers, acquisitions, influence, but they never captured what had really happened, how a single decision, made with nothing but clarity and courage, had shifted the trajectory of his life. He woke up most mornings alone in his penthouse overlooking the city, a space that felt both luxurious and eerily empty. He didn't inhabit it to show status. He inhabited it to see everything from a vantage point others couldn't reach. From there, the flow of his empire was visible in abstract patterns, supply chains, capital streams, human networks. Lines invisible to most revealed themselves to him like constellations in the night sky. Even with all the wealth, the real lesson never left him. Scarcity breeds sharpness. Comfort breeds blindness. And he remembered every night he had slept on a thin mattress, wondering how he'd get the next meal. He carried that memory like a compass. He began mentoring quietly, not for attention, not for philanthropy in the traditional sense. He taught select people how to observe, how to anticipate, how to create leverage out of gaps everyone else ignored. He repeated one principle endlessly: money is transient, power is fleeting. Influence is earned in silence, maintained by precision, and multiplied by understanding what no one else bothers to notice. By 55, he realized that wealth was not the ultimate measure. Legacy was. And legacy wasn't built in grand gestures or headlines. It was built in systems, in people empowered to think clearly, in networks that could function even when he was absent. He began formalizing knowledge, documenting processes, recording lessons. Every mistake, every tiny victory, every quiet observation was cataloged. The $0 decision was the seed, but the system, the culture, and the people were the tree. Then came the final reflection. He understood that the first billion wasn't the result of luck, intelligence, or early opportunity. It was the product of restraint, observation, and an ability to act decisively when no one else would. The $0 decision hadn't made him rich. It had made him aware. Awareness was leverage. Leverage created opportunity. Opportunity compounded into power. Power, wielded wisely, created wealth, and wealth, if handled correctly, could shape industries, economies, and lives. But he never flaunted it. His empire's presence was quiet, necessary, unavoidable. He didn't need accolades to validate him. Those who worked within the systems he designed understood that disruption could come quietly, invisibly, and with finality. That was influence in its purest form. By 60, historians would describe him as a billionaire. Analysts would speak of vertical integration, smart acquisitions, strategic foresight. The media would summarize years of decisions in neat graphs and charts. Few would grasp the invisible threads connecting a man at $0 to an empire that touched every sector he cared about. And he didn't care, because he had learned the real secret long ago. The measure of success isn't wealth, it isn't even influence. It is the courage to act when there is nothing, the wisdom to watch when there is power, and the restraint to preserve what is truly important. Looking out the window one morning, he saw the city moving below, people rushing, ignoring the invisible structures keeping their world stable. He smiled quietly. The $0 decision had been made decades ago in a tiny, grimy apartment. A simple choice: stop begging for permission, stop waiting for approval, and start observing, learning, and creating value where no one else would. That decision cost nothing, but had returned everything. He poured himself coffee and picked up his notebook, not to chase more money, not to chase fame, but to continue mapping the invisible patterns, teaching the few, and preserving the systems that could outlast him. He was no longer playing the game. He had become the framework within which the game was played. And in that silence, surrounded by everything and nothing, he realized the final truth. Being broke once was not a failure. It was the most powerful education he could have had. And the $0 decision, made quietly, without fanfare, without anyone noticing, had made him unstoppable. Forward was all that remained.
He sat quietly in his study, the early morning light filtering through tall windows, dust motes drifting lazily in its path. The city hummed below, unaware of the invisible hands guiding parts of its machinery. He had become, in ways few would ever understand, indispensable. Not through aggression, not through noise, but through observation, precision, and patience. The $0 decision echoed in his mind, not as a memory, but as a framework. It was a silent pact with himself. When everything is stripped away, clarity becomes your currency, courage your leverage, and learning your only asset. He remembered the nights of hunger, the empty mailbox, the cold floor beneath him, and the panic that clawed at his chest. Those moments had forged him, tempered him into a man capable of moving without notice, yet influencing everything around him. He thought about the people who had crossed his path, the skeptics, the dismissers, the ones who underestimated him. Some had become allies, some remained cautionary tales. Each had served a purpose, each had been data. He smiled quietly at the thought. Life, he realized, was a ledger of experiences, and the smartest operator understood not only where to act, but where not to act. Wealth had come, influence had come, recognition in muted forms had come. But the true reward was the understanding of leverage itself, that control, not chaos, was the ultimate power, that systems, not effort, scaled infinitely, and that a single choice, made without anything to lose, could ripple decades into the future. He rose, walking past framed diagrams of processes, charts of dependencies, and notes of past failures. Each one told a story. Each one was proof that zero didn't mean powerless, that the smallest action at the right time could become monumental, that lessons learned in scarcity could never be purchased in abundance. Outside, the city moved on, as it always did. Markets fluctuated, people hustled, opportunities appeared and disappeared. Yet he remained a constant, silent, unseen, yet central. The empire he controlled wasn't flashy, it didn't roar, it worked, reliably, invisibly, unshakably. He sat again at his desk and opened his notebook, pen in hand, not for the pursuit of more wealth, not for the chase of recognition, but to continue the work that mattered most, understanding flow, mapping leverage, preserving knowledge, and teaching the few who were ready to learn. A legacy not of gold or fame, but of insight and discipline. He thought of the young man he once was, 29, broke, unsure, desperate. He would never forget him. That version of himself was his compass, his reminder that everything started with one simple, courageous choice. The $0 decision that had seemed insignificant, almost invisible at the time, had shaped not just a life, but an empire, a philosophy, a pattern that would outlast him. He smiled. Nothing flashy, nothing loud, just certainty in the quiet that he had finally learned the real game and played it perfectly. And so he moved forward, unrelenting, unstoppable, invisible yet central, shaping everything without anyone fully noticing, a force born from nothing yet influencing everything. The world, as always, rushed past, unaware that its rhythm had been quietly rewritten decades ago in a small room with nothing but courage, curiosity, and a decision to start with zero.
The end was never the goal. The journey never truly ends, but the $0 decision, once made, had ensured that every next step carried power, wisdom, and the quiet inevitability of mastery.